The sun broke through the veil of snow clouds slowly, like an old man pulling back the curtain of a window he hadn't opened in years. Ray stood at his door with a thermos in one hand and a quiet in his bones. The storm had passed, leaving everything blanketed in a harsh, brilliant white. The trees were brittle with ice, and even the sound of birds seemed frozen out of the world. But his front yard wasn't empty. 3 black SUVs sat like shadows on the snow, engines humming low, their presence unmistakably official. U.S. Air Force insignia glinted off the sides. Not the kind of vehicle one expected on a narrow Montana road, not this early, and not in this kind of weather. Uniformed men stood in the snow, alert but motionless. Their breath came out in clouds as they scanned the perimeter of his property, not in panic, but in protocol. Ray didn't flinch. Years ago, his body might have tensed, but now it simply noted and absorbed. His instincts were still there, buried under layers of worn denim and arthritis, but still sharp. On the porch behind him, the man from the night before was already buttoning a coat that hadn't been his when he arrived. It was military-issued, clean and dry, brought by one of the officers who had moved with silent urgency into Ray's yard. He stood straighter now. The shaking in his hands had stopped. His face had changed, not in expression, but in presence, as though the cold and exhaustion had peeled away a disguise. He was no longer the lost man by the roadside. He was someone else entirely. Ray glanced at the vehicles, then at the man. He nodded once. The man returned it. The officers approached carefully. One of them removed a glove and extended a hand. Ray didn't take it, not out of disrespect, but because he didn't need to. Respect, to him, was never in handshakes. It was in whether a man left a place better than he found it. A single sentence passed between them, short and quiet. Then the man climbed into one of the SUVs. The convoy turned around slowly in the snow and disappeared up the ridge road, leaving only tire tracks and questions. Ray stood there for a long moment. The thermos warmed his hands. The air bit at the corners of his coat. He turned back inside and poured the coffee into his favorite mug, gray ceramic, chipped on one edge. He set it on the table. Then he rinsed the bowl the stranger had used, placed it in the drying rack, and swept the scattered ash from the hearth. By the time he arrived at the shop, Bellevue had already started buzzing. The general's name wasn't immediately known, but the presence of the vehicles had been noted by more than a few curious neighbors. A kid had posted a blurry video on social media showing one of the SUVs driving off, and by lunch, a local radio host was speculating that someone in town had been involved in a rescue. People at the diner asked around. Old Man Willoughby at the post office claimed he'd seen 2 men in earpieces, and one of them was clearly carrying a sidearm. Theories bloomed like wildflowers. Some believed it was a secret arrest, others said the government was testing something in the mountains. Ray said nothing. He spent the day beneath the hood of a Subaru, tuning the idle, replacing a worn belt, wiping grease from his knuckles. A neighbor named Ellen stopped by with her grandson's bicycle. He fixed the broken chain while she chatted about the storm and how lucky everyone was that the power hadn't gone out longer. They say someone pulled the general out of the snow, she mused. Can you believe that? Right here in Bellevue. She chuckled. You'd think someone would have seen something. Ray only nodded. Later that evening, as he sat by the fire with a book he'd read before and a dog-eared photograph of his late wife on the shelf beside him, he thought about the moment when he had first seen the man in the ditch. No insignia. No warning. Just a figure in trouble. That had been enough. There had been no time for questions, no time to weigh consequences. There had only been cold, and a human being standing in it. He remembered the man's hands, shaking as they clutched the hot mug. The sound of snow melting off his coat onto the rug. The way he'd slept, tense at first, then slowly yielding to exhaustion. There was something in that sleep that reminded Ray of his younger self. The way men sometimes rested only when their bodies had no more to give. The way silence becomes sacred after too many years of noise. The next morning, the town paper published a small headline, Military Presence Linked to Search and Rescue. No names were mentioned. No photographs. Just a short column describing how a missing senior officer had been located with the help of an unnamed civilian in the Bellevue area. That was enough to stir the gossip again, but Ray's name never came up. And he preferred it that way. He went back to his workbench the next day. The bell above the shop door chimed as customers came and went. He handed back fixed alternators, sharpened mower blades, replaced radiator hoses. His movements remained as steady as ever, the quiet rhythm of a man whose life wasn't shaken easily anymore. Only at night, when the wind howled across the hills and frost clung to the corners of the window, did he let the memory return. Not because he was proud, and not because he expected anything in return, but because the world, for just one night, had reminded him that helping wasn't weakness, and that somewhere out there, a man in uniform still remembered the warmth of a stranger's fire. The days returned to their routine, like wheels slipping back into an old, familiar groove. Ray opened the shop each morning at 7, just as the sun began to melt the ice from the power lines. He repaired tractors and snowblowers, sharpened chainsaw blades dulled by the storm cleanup. People came and went. They thanked him. He nodded, said little. Life in Bellevue rarely asked for explanations, and Ray had grown used to answering questions with gestures instead of words. Then, on a Thursday that began no differently than any other, something changed. He heard them before he saw them. The low, synchronized rumble of diesel engines, precise, deliberate. Not farmers' trucks or delivery vans. This was something else. When Ray stepped outside, the scene was like déjà vu, but with sharper edges. A convoy, this time of military-grade utility vehicles, pulled into his gravel driveway. Not sleek SUVs, but boxy transport rigs, marked with stenciled lettering. Men in uniform disembarked, but they weren't the same as before. These weren't security officers or elite escorts. These were engineers. Technicians. Electricians. One of them nodded toward Ray as if they'd already been introduced. They hadn't. "We've been sent by General Hart," the man said plainly. "We've got instructions." Ray didn't ask. He just stepped back and let them do what they came to do. The crew moved quickly. A full heating system was delivered and installed within hours, high efficiency, industrial grade. The kind used on remote bases where winter was not an inconvenience but an adversary. His roof, sagging and patched with tarp, was stripped and rebuilt. They replaced the old shingles with reinforced metal panels, heat-coated and rust-proof. He didn't even see them measure. Then came the garage. What had once been a wooden outbuilding with rusting tools and a cracked cement floor was gutted, wired, insulated, and reborn. A workshop emerged. Clean, precise, military efficient. Tool chests arrived, red, locked, and gleaming. An overhead hoist system was installed. A new compressor. A computer terminal loaded with diagnostic software. Shelves filled with sealed cases marked donated surplus. Neighbors stood along the fence line watching, their breath fogging in the cold. Someone said, "Looks like the Pentagon moved into Bellevue." Someone else whispered, "What the hell did Ray Davis do?" But no one asked him directly. They had known Ray as the man who helped rewire their barn lights, who mended gates after storms without charging a dime, who once fixed a widow's furnace with parts from his own storage. But no one had imagined him as a man who knew generals. That weekend, the Sunday service at the local chapel included a prayer for all those who serve, both known and unknown. Pastor Green didn't say names. He didn't need to. By Monday, the rumors were thicker than the snow. At the diner, someone claimed Ray had once defused bombs for the Army. Another said he'd been a survival expert who trained elite soldiers. One man insisted he saw a metal case through Ray's window. The truth shrank beneath the weight of speculation. Ray kept his head down. A few townsfolk began knocking on his door, not out of suspicion, but curiosity softened by respect. One neighbor brought him a pie for the cold days ahead. A group of middle school students left a handmade thank you card on his porch, drawn in colored pencil, a stick figure in a winter coat helping another from a snowbank. It was signed from the class of Mrs. Dunley. He didn't hang the card inside, but he didn't throw it away either. Instead, he placed it in a wooden drawer beside an old dog tag, a folded map, and a yellowed photograph of men in camouflage, squinting into the desert sun. On the third day, a local newspaper reporter came by. Said he'd heard about the upgrades and wanted to highlight good neighbors doing good things. Ray declined the interview. The reporter lingered awkwardly, notebook in hand, before leaving his card on the fence post. It fluttered off in the wind that evening. Ray let it. What mattered to him wasn't who noticed. It was that someone had cared enough to act, not with words, but with effort. The man from the snowbank had remembered. And what he sent wasn't luxury, it was utility, function, warmth. A gesture not of gratitude alone, but of recognition. Ray returned to the new workshop the next morning. It still smelled of sawdust and paint. He laid his hand on the edge of the workbench and stood for a moment in silence. The light from the east window caught the edge of the new wrench set, arranged in perfect size order. He picked one up and turned it in his palm. Same weight. Same use. But now it rested in a place that someone had built, not for profit, not for praise, but because they believed a quiet act on a frozen road had meant something. The strange part was this: Ray didn't feel proud. He didn't feel heroic. What he felt was settled. Like something had been mended that he hadn't known was broken. And that, for the first time in a long time, maybe helping someone hadn't just been a one-way gift. Maybe, just maybe, it had changed something on both sides. It happened quietly, the way most things did in Ray Davis's life. No press releases, no official bulletins. Just a folded letter in an envelope with no return address, slipped under his shop door one Friday morning. Ray read it only once. The paper was thick. The ink pressed cleanly into the page. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. The handwriting, though formal, had the weight of something deeply personal. The words didn't mention titles or rank. They spoke of a night, a fire, and a silence that felt like safety. The letter ended with one line typed in bold. There are debts that are not owed in dollars, but in dignity. He folded the page, placed it in a tin box with his discharge papers and the bronze star he never displayed, then returned to work as if nothing had changed. But things had. Over the following weeks, small things began to appear. A thermos left on his porch, identical to the one he had loaned to the stranger that night, but new, embossed with a small Air Force insignia and his initials. A fleece jacket, military cut, and exactly his size, hung carefully on the shop door one morning, with a tag that simply read, "For cold roads." Then came the plaque. It was mounted not by Ray, but by someone else. A small team arrived early one Saturday and fixed it to the fence post facing the road. The metal shone clean against the aging wood, the lettering etched deep. Here lives a man who didn't ask who you were to help you. No name. No date. Just the words. Neighbors came to see it. Some stood quietly and left flowers by the gate. A few brought their children and explained what kindness could look like in real life. Ray never spoke about it, never offered commentary. But he noticed how people slowed when they passed, how conversations around him changed. The ones who had once gossiped about his silence now spoke with reverence. Even the ones who had mocked his solitude now stood beside him in line at the hardware store, nodding with a respect that needed no words. And then, 1 month later, the general returned. There were no sirens. No fanfare. Just a single black vehicle arriving at the edge of Bellevue on a cold March morning. General Hart stepped out alone, wearing no formal dress. He walked with a limp that hadn't been there before and carried a small leather case in one hand. Ray met him on the front step. They didn't shake hands. They simply stood together in the morning frost, two men bound not by obligation, but by something deeper, something earned. Inside the Veterans Hall, the others were already waiting. Word had gone out quietly. The room was filled not with officials, but with people who knew service, former soldiers, quiet mechanics, teachers, farmers, and old men with fading tattoos. They stood when the general entered. He didn't speak from a podium. Instead, he approached Ray directly, opened the case, and revealed a round medallion, silver, smooth, weighty in the hand. It wasn't a military issue. It bore no serial number. Around its edge, engraved with care, were the words, "For serving the person, not the title." He placed it in Ray's hand and held it there for a moment. Not as an award, but as a recognition, one man telling another, "You mattered," when no one else could have. No photos were taken. No reporters wrote a story. But everyone in that room remembered. Especially those who had once questioned Ray's silence, who now watched as a general of the United States Air Force stood humbly before a man who lived in a farmhouse and fixed broken engines. Ray didn't say much that day. He thanked them. He stayed for a while, shook a few hands, and left when the hall got too loud. He preferred the sound of tools and wind through pine more than applause. The medallion went into the tin box, beside the letter. That night, the fire burned low. The air outside bit at the windows, but Ray didn't notice. He sat in his chair, the familiar one, with a coffee he had reheated twice but hadn't yet finished. The photo of his wife still sat on the mantel, watching over him as she always had. And now, beside it, was the new thermos, upright and gleaming, like a symbol that even the smallest warmth could ripple through the coldest storm. Ray never told the full story to anyone. But he didn't need to. Because people in Bellevue changed. Strangers were helped without hesitation. A high school student started clearing snow from the elderly neighbors' drives before sunrise. A local diner began leaving out free meals labeled extras. Someone started hanging donated jackets on the fence near the bus stop, with a sign that read, "Take what you need." Ray saw all of it, quietly. He never said the change came from him. But he recognized it, the way a soldier recognizes the first sunrise after a long night watch. The man who had once lived quietly, alone with his tools and his ghosts, had become something more than himself. He had become a symbol. Not of valor or power, but of something rarer. Of kindness with no questions. Of help given without need for recognition. Of how one simple act, pulling a man from the snow and giving him a bowl of soup, could ripple outward until the whole town remembered what it meant to take care of each other. Ray Davis never asked for thanks. But in the silence that followed, the world thanked him anyway. And in that silence, he finally found peace.